He was just a boy who wanted to dance. His legs were fragile, unsteady from the moment he learned to walk, yet his spirit glowed brighter than anyone else in that crowded school gym. That night was supposed to be magical, a celebration of joy, laughter, and milestones. Children twirled beneath glittering lights, parents smiled proudly from the sidelines, and music carried dreams across the polished floor. But for him, it wasn't just another school dance. Every step he took was a quiet victory, every movement a battle against a body that often betrayed him. And behind those steps stood Grace, the nanny who had guided him with endless patience, who had seen his courage when no one else would. She had practiced with him for weeks, lifting him when he fell, reminding him that he was stronger than he believed. Yet as the families gathered, dressed in silk and pressed suits, one truth became painfully clear. Grace was not welcome. To them, she was not family, not equal, not someone they wanted in the spotlight beside their son. Her dark skin was enough to draw whispered stares and cold disapproval. What no one expected was that when the boy stumbled, when pride and appearances abandoned him, it would be Grace, the very woman they rejected, who stepped forward. And in doing so, she exposed not just their prejudice, but a truth that left the entire room silent. What happened on that dance floor didn't just change one boy's night. It revealed a reality too many try to ignore. And the question that lingers is this: when dignity collides with prejudice, who truly stands by you? The school gymnasium was alive with anticipation. Bright balloons clung to the ceiling. The faint scent of freshly waxed floors mixed with the sweetness of cupcakes lined up at the refreshment table. Teachers hurried about, fixing ribbons and straightening banners, their voices layered over the hum of excited chatter. For most families, this dance was a tradition, a page in the scrapbook that parents would frame and cherish for years. For the wealthy, it was a stage to be admired. For the children, it was a night of belonging, of laughter, of spinning dresses and polished shoes tapping to the rhythm of joy. But for one boy, this night meant something entirely different. He wasn't like the others. His legs, weakened by a disability since birth, made each step an act of defiance. Walking wasn't simple. It was a struggle, a lesson in courage repeated every day. Running, jumping, dancing, these were things he had only dared to dream of. Yet his dreams weren't empty. They were fueled by the countless hours he spent practicing with the one person who believed he could do more than anyone else imagined. Grace. Grace was more than a nanny. To outsiders, she might have looked like an employee hired to manage the difficult work of caring for a child who demanded patience and strength. But to the boy, she was everything: teacher, cheerleader, protector, and friend. She rose before dawn to prepare his breakfast, helped him dress when his fingers shook with frustration, steadied his small frame when his knees buckled. She walked him to school, waded through his therapy sessions, and at night whispered encouragements that stitched courage into the fabric of his heart. She was the steady rhythm of his days, the constant voice that reminded him he was not defined by his limitations. But love has a way of exposing fractures in places where pride and prejudice live. The boy's parents were pillars of the community, wealthy, well-connected, and obsessed with appearances. They attended charity galas, shook hands with the right people, and ensured every photograph captured them at just the right angle. To neighbors and colleagues, they were enviable. To their son, they were distant. They cared for him, yes, but in a way that often felt conditional, tied to how his presence reflected on them. They wanted him to succeed not for his joy, but for their pride. Grace's devotion made them uncomfortable. They never said it outright, but the sharp glances, the clipped tones, the rigid boundaries spoke louder than words. To them, Grace was help, useful, but never equal. And though they depended on her for everything their son needed, they drew an invisible line. She was not to blur the boundary between employment and family, and certainly not in public. The dance was a perfect example. For weeks, the boy had spoken about it with growing excitement. He wanted to dance not like the other kids, not spinning and leaping, but just to stand in the center of that gym and move with the music, to prove that he belonged. Grace had practiced with him every day, holding his arms, teaching him rhythm. guiding his steps until his wobbles became something close to a dance. When he fell, she picked him up, her words stronger than any therapy. You are capable. You are brave. You will shine. In secret, the boy imagined Grace beside him on that night, her hand steady, her smile giving him courage. But when the subject came up at home, his parents dismissed the idea. This is a family event, his mother said sharply, as though Grace's presence threatened the family's image. His father nodded in agreement, brushing off the suggestion, as if it were absurd. Grace said nothing. Her eyes lowered, but the silence pressed heavy against her heart. She knew her place. Or at least, she knew the place they wanted her to occupy. She wasn't naive to the way the world saw her. A black woman in a wealthy, white household, always in the background, always unseen when it mattered. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. Every time she was asked to step aside, every time her devotion was treated as transactional, it was a wound reopened. Still, she prepared the boy for the dance as if she would be there. She pressed his shirt until the fabric shone, polished his shoes until they reflected light, and combed his hair with gentle precision. She whispered courage into his ears as she buttoned his cuffs. He clung to her words like lifelines, repeating them to himself in the mirror. I can do this. I can stand tall. I can dance. The night arrived, cool and crisp. The sky stretched wide above the glowing school windows. Families arrived in luxury cars, parents stepping out in tailored suits and elegant gowns, children tumbling out in a flurry of excitement. The gym buzzed with life, every corner filled with laughter, chatter, and flashing cameras. The boy entered slowly, his crutches clicking softly against the floor. His parents walked beside him, smiling broadly for appearances, while Grace followed, just a step behind. She kept her distance, careful not to overstep, but her eyes never left him. She could see the nervousness in his tightened grip, the determination etched into his small face. The room was alive with joy, but beneath the surface, tension stirred. Grace could feel the stares, subtle but sharp. Parents whispered, their eyes sliding toward her, curious and disapproving. To them, she was out of place. To her, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, standing close enough to catch him if he fell. The boy's parents didn't notice the whispers, or maybe they did and simply didn't care. They were too focused on ensuring their son looked the part, too consumed with the image of perfection they wanted to project. Grace, on the other hand, felt every glance like a thorn, every murmur a reminder that she was tolerated only in the shadows. Still, she stood quietly, waiting. She didn't know exactly how the night would unfold, but she knew one thing: if he needed her, she would not stay silent, because for him, this wasn't just a dance. It was a test, and for her, it was a promise she refused to break. The gym was dazzling under the glow of string lights, each bulb flickering like a captured star. Music thumped from speakers, making the floorboards vibrate as children twirled and stumbled in playful delight. Laughter echoed off the walls, mixing with the shuffle of shoes and the snapping of cameras, but not everyone was watching the dance floor. Some eyes were fixed elsewhere, on the boy and on Grace. At first, it was subtle. A mother tugging her daughter closer, a whispered word hidden behind a cupped hand, a sideways glance quickly disguised as indifference. Grace felt the weight of those eyes pressing into her, heavier with each passing minute. She stood at the edge of the gym, careful to keep her posture composed, her face calm. Inside, however, a storm churned. She had been here before, in grocery stores, in playgrounds, in restaurants, always the shadow that didn't quite belong. But tonight, with the boy so eager and fragile, those looks cut sharper than ever. The boy noticed too, though he tried not to. He caught snippets of whispers. Is that their nanny? Why is she here? Don't they know this is for families? Each word burrowed into him, planting seeds of shame that Grace had spent years pulling out by the roots. His grip on the crutches tightened until his knuckles blanched. His parents, however, were blissfully or willfully unaware. They floated through the room, greeting friends with practiced smiles, their voices carrying that air of polished ease. They bragged about their son's progress, about his determination, about the doctors they had hired. Not once did they mention Grace, the woman who had been the backbone of every small victory. To them, she was invisible, a silent fixture that need not be acknowledged. The first song ended, and the crowd applauded as couples of children bowed dramatically. Teachers clapped, parents cheered, and cameras flashed like starlight. Then came the announcement. The floor was open for everyone. The boy froze. This was the moment he had imagined over and over again in his mind. He saw himself stepping into the center, moving with courage, showing everyone he belonged. But standing there, with eyes already burning into him, fear clawed at his chest. His parents smiled down at him, urging him forward with gentle nudges, but their encouragement felt hollow. They weren't offering support, they were offering expectation. He turned instinctively toward Grace. Her eyes met his, warm and steady, the same eyes that had guided him through countless stumbles. He wanted her there with him, wanted her hand on his shoulder, her voice in his ear. But when he whispered, almost inaudibly, "Grace, will you?" his mother stiffened instantly. "Not now." She hissed through a clenched smile, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "This is your moment. With us." The boy's heart sank. He looked back at Grace, who stood rooted to the floor, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She gave him a small nod, a silent assurance that she was still there. But he felt the gulf widening, the distance forced between them by people who didn't understand what she truly meant to him. He took a shaky step toward the dance floor. The crowd clapped politely, offering smiles that were more curious than kind. He tried to move to the music, lifting one foot, then the other, his body swaying awkwardly. But the rhythm slipped away from him. His legs wobbled, his crutches clicked against the polished floor, and a hush rippled through the crowd. Someone chuckled, not loudly, but enough for others to hear, enough to draw a few more whispers. Heat flooded the boy's face. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance, his crutches scraping loudly in protest. His father's smile faltered. His mother's hand twitched as if she wanted to intervene but feared the embarrassment it might bring. Grace's instincts screamed to rush forward. Every fiber of her being urged her to step onto that floor, to catch him, to shield him from those eyes. But she stayed frozen, knowing too well what it would mean: the accusations, the judgment, the unspoken rules of where she was allowed to stand. Then the music shifted, a new song beginning, faster and livelier. The crowd's attention returned to their own children, the whispers fading into background noise. The boy stood stranded in the center, his heart pounding, his chest tightening with shame. His dream of belonging cracked beneath the weight of reality. He glanced again at Grace. This time, his eyes weren't just asking, they were pleading. Her hands trembled. She thought of every moment they had shared, every stumble, every tear, every whispered promise. And she knew. No glare, no rule, no prejudice could outweigh the vow she had made to him. Still, hesitation lingered. She thought of the parents around her, of the boy's mother's sharp words, of the invisible boundaries drawn around her. She thought of how quickly one act of kindness could be twisted into overstepping. The fear of consequence pressed against her chest like a weight. But then she saw his foot slip again, his body tilt dangerously, his crutch sliding out of place. And in that instant, the choice was no longer hers to wrestle with. It was made for her. She stepped forward. One step, then another, the sound of her shoes against the polished floor cutting through the music. A few heads turned, whispers ignited. Once more, his mother's face stiffened, her father's jaw clenched. But Grace no longer heard them. She heard only the sound of his uneven breathing, the desperate rhythm of his crutches scraping the floor. By the time she reached him, he was on the verge of collapse. Gently, firmly, she placed a hand on his arm. His entire body eased at her touch, his trembling slowing, his balance returning. Together, they stood tall. The room fell quieter. Parents exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. Some disapproved, some pitied, a few even softened. But for the boy, none of it mattered anymore. Grace was there, his anchor, his courage, and though the whispers still stirred in the corners of the room, A shift had begun, a shift neither his parents, nor the crowd, nor even Grace herself fully understood yet, because what started as whispers of disapproval was about to transform into something no one expected, something that would change everything. The music swelled again, louder this time, filling every corner of the gym with a beat meant for celebration. But celebration was the last thing the boy felt. With Grace's steadying hand at his side, he stood tall in the center of the dance floor, every eye in the room fixed on him. His chest rose and fell in sharp breaths. The whispers that had haunted him all evening had turned into silence, and, even heavier burden, he could feel his parents' eyes boring into him, their faces stretched tight with forced smiles. Their polished image, their carefully crafted perfection, was cracking under the weight of this moment. In their eyes, Grace's presence wasn't a gesture of love but a spectacle, a scene that threatened to expose them to ridicule. The boy, though, saw something else entirely. He saw the woman who had been there every morning when he struggled to tie his shoes, every evening when his legs gave way. He saw the one person who had never looked at him with pity, only with belief. And with her hand steadying his trembling frame, he felt something stir inside him, something stronger than the shame, louder than the whispers. He moved, not gracefully, not like the other children who spun and twirled without effort, but with courage. One step forward, a sway, then another step. His crutches clicked against the floor in rhythm, each tap a defiant drumbeat echoing through the silent crowd. His body wobbled, his balance faltered, but Grace adjusted seamlessly, guiding him with the gentleness of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The crowd's silence deepened. A few murmurs rose, half curiosity, half disbelief. Parents shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to watch, to applaud, or to turn away. Some frowned, their prejudice unmasked in furrowed brows and tight lips. Others softened, something like admiration flickering in their eyes. But the loudest reactions came from his parents. His mother's smile was stretched thin, her eyes darting to the other parents as if trying to gauge their judgment. His father's jaw was rigid, his hands tightening around his phone, knuckles pale. They were watching their son stand bravely in the spotlight, but all they seemed to see was Grace, standing beside him, holding him upright, claiming a place. They had tried so hard to deny her. The boy lifted his chin, forcing himself to keep going. He swayed again, then took another shaky step, the music wrapping around him like a challenge. For a fleeting second, he forgot the stares. He forgot the whispers. He forgot the fear. All he felt was movement, the joy of proving to himself that he could do it. But then, a stumble. His foot caught awkwardly, his body pitched forward, and gasps rippled through the room. His crutches clattered loudly against the floor. The moment teetered on the edge of disaster. Grace tightened her grip, holding him steady, pulling him back before he fell. Her face was calm, her movements fluid, as though she had anticipated it all along. She bent her head slightly toward him, whispering encouragement only he could hear. The boy steadied himself, lifted his head again, and continued. This time, the crowd reacted differently. The gasps gave way to murmurs of awe. A few people began to clap softly, tentatively, unsure if it was welcome. Then more joined. The applause grew, spreading through the gym like wildfire. Soon, it was a roar of cheers, claps, shouts of encouragement. That filled the room louder than the music itself. The boy's heart soared. His face broke into a smile, wide and genuine, his eyes shining with tears. For the first time that night, he felt not like an outcast, not like a fragile child defined by limits, but like a star in his own right. He swayed with the music, his movements imperfect but radiant. Each step a victory. Grace's eyes glistened, too, though she held her composure. She had always known he had this strength within him. But seeing it unfold, seeing the crowd finally recognize what she had known all along, it was overwhelming. But not everyone was clapping. His parents stood, frozen, their expressions masks of discomfort and thinly veiled anger. To them, the applause was not for their son alone. It was for Grace, to the woman they had worked so hard to keep in the background. In this moment, She wasn't invisible. She was central. She was indispensable. And for parents who valued appearances above truth, that was unbearable. When the song ended, the crowd erupted into cheers. Teachers wiped at their eyes. Students clapped enthusiastically. And even some of the parents who had whispered cruelly before now looked at the boy with admiration. He had done it. He had stood in the spotlight, danced with courage, and silenced the doubt. But as the applause rang in his ears, the boy turned toward his parents. His smile faltered when he saw their faces tight, cold, unyielding. Their hands didn't clap. Their eyes didn't soften, and in that moment, the boy understood something painful. To them, this wasn't triumph. It was humiliation. Grace released his arm gently, letting him stand on his own as the cheers died down. She stayed close, but not too close, trying to respect the invisible lines even as she had crossed them. But the boy reached for her again, his small hand grasping hers tightly, pulling her closer. It was an instinctive act, simple and pure, but it sent a shockwave through the room. Gasps echoed. A few parents whispered again, their voices dripping with disapproval. His mother's face flushed crimson, his father's lips pressed into a hard line. For them, this was the breaking point. Their son, holding the hand of the woman they wanted hidden, in front of everyone. But the boy didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't performing for them. He wasn't seeking their approval, or the crowd's, or anyone's. He was holding on to the one person who had never let him fall. The music shifted again. Another song beginning. The crowd waited, curious, wondering if he would continue. He lifted his chin, and with Grace by his side, he stepped forward again. The gym erupted. This time, the applause wasn't tentative, it was thunderous. A wave of cheers and claps that filled the space to bursting. Some parents wiped tears, others shook their heads in disbelief, but no one could deny what they were witnessing. A boy refusing to be defined by his disability, a woman refusing to let prejudice silence her role in his life. It was messy. It was imperfect, but it was beautiful. And for the first time, the boy felt what it was like to truly dance. The cheers lingered in the boy's ears long after the music faded. For a fleeting moment, he stood taller than he ever had in his life, not because his body had suddenly grown stronger, but because courage had carried him farther than his legs ever could. Grace's hand was still in his, warm and steady, anchoring him in the storm of emotions swirling through the gym. But as the applause waned and the crowd returned to their conversations, reality crept back in. The boy's parents approached, their faces etched with a stiffness that no amount of polite smiles could mask. To the onlookers, they were composed, whispering a few obligatory congratulations, but their eyes cold, sharp, told another story. To them, what had just happened wasn't triumph, it was betrayal. Grace felt it instantly. The air around them thickened as his mother leaned down, her hand brushing her son's shoulder in a gesture that looked tender but carried an unspoken warning. His father's gaze lingered on Grace, hard and accusatory, as though daring her to celebrate the moment she had helped create. But the boy wasn't looking at them. He was still basking in the glow of what he had done. He squeezed Grace's hand tighter, his eyes bright, his heart swelling with something he couldn't yet name but would remember forever. Pride. The rest of the night moved in a blur. Parents ushered children out, teachers stacked chairs, and the decorations drooped as the air grew heavy with exhaustion. Families left with smiles, their cameras filled with snapshots of laughter and twirling dresses. But for one family, the walk to the car was silent, suffocating. The boy sat in the back seat, his crutches resting against the door. His parents sat rigid in the front, the tension between them thick enough to choke. Grace sat beside him, her presence both a comfort and a lightning rod. The silence broke only once, when his father muttered, low and sharp, "That will not happen again." The boy flinched, his heart dropping. He looked at Grace, who kept her eyes forward, her face unreadable, but inside, her heart was breaking. She knew what those words meant. They weren't about the dance. They were about her. Back at the house, the boy's parents retreated quickly to their study, their voices rising behind closed doors. The boy lingered in the hallway, hearing fragments Embarrassment. Overstepping. Not her place. He understood enough. They weren't angry at him. They were angry at her. He turned to Grace, who stood quietly in the kitchen, tidying dishes that didn't need tidying. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to tell her how much he needed her, but the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he leaned against her side, resting his head on her arm. She didn't speak either, but she reached down, smoothed his hair, and whispered the same words she always did when the world felt too heavy. "You are brave. You are enough." In the days that followed, the echoes of the dance rippled outward. Parents who had once whispered behind cupped hands now shared stories of the boy's courage, some praising his determination, others retelling the moment with awe. Teachers spoke of it in classrooms. Students replayed it in their chatter. Slowly, the narrative shifted, but inside the boy's home, the atmosphere hardened. His parents grew colder with Grace, their instructions clipped, their tolerance thinning. She was no longer invited to linger during family meals, no longer allowed to accompany him on outings. They wanted distance. They wanted control. They wanted to erase the memory of her standing in the spotlight with their son, yet the boy refused to let the memory fade. He spoke of it constantly, how the crowd clapped, how he danced, how he stood tall. Each time, his parents forced smiles, but their eyes betrayed irritation. Each time, Grace listened with patience, her smile genuine, her heart torn between pride and dread. One evening, the boy asked his mother directly, "Why are you mad at Grace? She helped me." The room went still. His mother's lips pressed thin. His father looked away. They didn't answer, not because they didn't have one, but because the truth that their prejudice had blinded them to the love that saved their son was a truth they could never say aloud. Grace knew her time with them might be limited. She had seen it before: families who used her love and labor, then cast her aside when her presence threatened their pride. The thought of leaving him shattered her, but she also knew that what had happened at the dance could never be undone. She had stood beside him, openly, visibly, undeniably, and whether his parents accepted it or not, that bond was no longer something they could erase. And the boy, he carried that night like a shield. In the weeks and months that followed, when classmates teased him, when strangers stared too long, when frustration boiled over in therapy sessions, he thought back to that gym, to the sound of applause, to the feeling of standing tall with Grace by his side. It reminded him he was more than his disability, more than the limitations others placed on him. Years later, when he was old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened, he would look back and see it clearly: the racism that had tried to silence Grace, the prejudice that had tried to keep her in the shadows. He would see how those forces had nearly robbed him of his moment, but he would also see how courage hers and his had defied it, because in that moment, Grace had refused to let society's boundaries dictate her love, and he had refused to let fear define his life. The world outside their home kept moving, as it always does. New scandals replaced old whispers. New events filled the community calendar. But for those who had been there that night, the image lingered. A boy on shaky legs, dancing with the help of the woman the world wanted to ignore. Some saw only awkwardness. Others saw courage. But no one could deny it had happened. And for the boy and Grace, that was enough. But here is the harder truth. Their story isn't rare. Across towns and cities, across schools and households, countless people like Grace are pushed aside, their love unseen, their devotion diminished because of the color of their skin. Countless children are taught, quietly and cruelly, that the ones who hold them up don't belong in the spotlight, and countless moments of courage are almost stolen, not by failure, but by prejudice. The boy's story is not just his. It is a reflection of a world that still struggles to see love without bias, to value devotion without prejudice, to allow dignity without condition. So ask yourself, how many more children will have their courage silenced? How many more Graces will be forced into the shadows? And how long will we allow racism, subtle or blatant, to dictate whose love is recognized and whose is ignored? The boys' dance ended that night, but the questions it raises are still dancing around us, waiting for answers. And maybe the real question is this: When the moment comes, will we stay silent in the crowd, or will we step onto the floor?